Ruth Bader Ginsburg, or RBG, was one of the most prominent Supreme Court justices of our time. On the court from 1993 until her death in 2020, Ruth Bader Ginsburg had her fingerprints all over SCOTUS, whether in majority opinions or dissents. Here's the untold truth of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. According to the American Bar Association, the average U.S. Supreme Court opinion contains 4,751 words. Each of those words serves a purpose, whether it's helping to establish the facts of a case, identifying legal questions, or laying out the rationale and ramifications of a ruling. Those words have power to change laws and lives, so every sentence must be carefully crafted. Luckily for RBG, one of her college professors was a phenomenal wordsmith. Per NBC, while studying at Cornell as an undergrad, Ginsburg took a European literature class taught by Vladimir Nabokov, who famously authored Lolita. In case you haven't read it, Lolita is the fictional first-person account of a man who abuses his stepdaughter after his wife dies. The Independent called it one of the great works of art of the 20th century, and honestly, if you can get past the feeling of your soul vomiting, it's really an engrossing read. Emphasis on gross. Anyone who can make the unspeakable enjoyable to read must be a gifted writer. Ginsburg said of Nabokov, "Choosing the right word and the right word order," he illustrated, "could make an enormous difference in conveying an image or an idea." As a justice, Ginsburg also attempted, quote, "to paint pictures when writing opinions." Supreme Court decisions are kind of like those math problems in school where the teacher requires you to show your work, to show that you not only got the right solution, but did your work in the right way. In her role as Supreme Court Justice, RBG firmly believed that women should have the right to get an abortion, but thought that Roe v. Wade was the wrong way to achieve that because of its implications for future abortion cases.
It is essential to woman's equality with man that her choice, that she be the decision maker.
For context, in Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court ruled that women could have abortions for any reason in the first trimester of pregnancy based on their constitutionally protected right to privacy. However, the laws are different in the remaining 2 trimesters. For Ginsburg, that legal reasoning didn't quite add up. As a constitutional law professor explained to the Washington Post in 2016, RBG believed that for women to attain true equality with men, they must have sole control over their fertility. By that reasoning, tying women's autonomy to a conditional right to privacy established conditional equality and allowed for future restrictions, such as the 2007 SCOTUS ruling that upheld a federal ban on late-term abortions. Prior to her time on the Supreme Court, Ginsburg won a series of gender equality cases, including Frontiero v. Richardson, which made it illegal to restrict benefits for military spouses on the basis of sex. But not even Babe Ruth batted 1,000, so RBG was bound to lose sometime. That time came in 1974 in the case of Kahn v. Shevin, Ginsburg's only Supreme Court loss, according to the conversation. Plaintiff Mel Kahn was a widower seeking a tax exemption that Florida law only afforded to widows. Ginsburg argued that the law was unjust because she saw, quote, "discrimination against men and women is equally reprehensible." The Supreme Court disagreed in a 6-3 ruling, which said that single women face significantly more hardships in the job market than single men, and the disparity is particularly true for surviving spouses. Ironically, that disparity stemmed from the same sort of unequal treatment that Ginsburg was fighting against in Kahn's case. RGB's husband, Marty Ginsburg, wrote in a 2010 letter to Ruth, "You are the only person I have loved in my life. I have admired and loved you almost since the day we first met at Cornell some 56 years ago." RBG, quote, "might have taken a little longer to fall in love," her son James told People, but once her and Marty's hearts aligned, they had the kind of love some people only dream of. Married in 1954, Marty and Ruth completed each other. He was an excellent chef, she was a dreadful cook, she was a shy introvert, and he was a clever extrovert. When they attended law school and Marty contracted testicular cancer, Ruth shouldered the load of caring for their daughter, Jane, and arranged for Marty's friends to take notes for him. They later won cases together as lawyers, and Marty vigorously lobbied for Ruth to be nominated for the Supreme Court. Sadly, he passed away from cancer in 2010. The next day, RBG delivered the Supreme Court's majority opinion on a case, believing that, quote, "Marty would have wanted it this way." RBG is thought of as a feminist icon, but really she could be a hero to anyone who values perseverance, sacrifice, and the pursuit of justice in general. Ginsburg learned those values from her own personal hero, her mother, Celia Bader. A garment factory worker during the Great Depression, Bader gave up her own chance to attend college in order to fund her brother's education. A woman with a passion for knowledge, she imbued young Ruth with a deep enthusiasm for learning. Per the Jewish Women's Archive, some of RBG's first childhood memories are of going to the library with her mother. Sadly, their time together was short. Celia Bader contracted cancer and died the day before her daughter's high school graduation. Looking back on their time together, Ginsburg described her mother as the bravest and strongest person I have known, who was taken from me much too soon. I pray that I may be all that she would have been had she lived in an age when women could aspire and achieve, and daughters are cherished as much as sons. Celia Bader never saw her daughter blossom into a history-making lawyer, but she was with Ginsburg in other ways. When arguing cases before the Supreme Court, she wore her mother's pin and earrings. Political discourse in the U.S. is what the Jerry Springer Show would be if you added more screaming and made it less classy, so you might expect Supreme Court justices on opposite ends of the political spectrum to at least throw books at each other on occasion. Yet the very liberal Ginsburg and the starkly conservative Antonin Scalia were besties on the bench. Ginsburg and Scalia became acquainted through academic circles in the 1970s per CNN, and they first worked together in 1982 as members of the D.C. Circuit of the U.S. Court of Appeals. 1993 marked the start of their lengthy tenure together on the Supreme Court. The pair shared a love of opera and enjoyed each other's company so much that they traveled abroad and liked to dine together on New Year's Eve. Obviously, they clashed on legal matters, but their gavel battles didn't get malicious. In fact, RBG and Scalia learned from each other, fine-tuning their own arguments in response to the other's objections. When Scalia passed away in 2016, Ginsburg summed up their friendship in a touching tribute. Toward the end of the opera Scalia-Ginsburg, tenor Scalia and soprano Ginsburg sing a duet. We are different, we are one. Different in our interpretation of written text, one in our reverence for the Constitution and the institution we serve. From our years together at the D.C. Circuit, we were best buddies. With the sole exception of Abe Fortas, who resigned to avoid impeachment, every judge appointed to the Supreme Court has held their position until death or voluntary retirement. That kind of job security is hard to come by, so naturally, nominees try to avoid controversy at all costs during confirmation hearings, the kind we saw during the confirmations of Justice Brett Kavanaugh. Ginsburg did everything she could to avoid controversies of this sort, including clamming up at key moments. Per NPR, the Ginsburg Rule is the term Republicans use to describe the policy of refusing to answer certain kinds of questions. During Ginsburg's confirmation hearings, she declined to answer questions about how she might rule in specific future cases. However, she may have been the most responsive SCOTUS nominee ever, and she thoroughly answered questions about her interpretation of the Constitution or judicial philosophy. Linguists at NYU looked at how Justice Ginsburg pronounced vowels and consonants while working as a lawyer in the 1970s and compared that to how she spoke after becoming a judge. A clear pattern emerged. Ginsburg appeared to suppress her accent and natural verbal mannerisms more as a lawyer than as a judge. Linguists attribute that shift to a phenomenon known as accommodation, whereby a person adjusts their speaking style to conform to their audience. As researcher Nathan Lefebvre explained, she was a female Jewish lawyer presenting before a Supreme Court that was made up mostly of white Protestants, at a time when feminists were being decried as strident and shrill-sounding. Once Ginsburg ascended to a position of power and security, she presumably felt more at ease with being herself on the bench. Ruth Bader Ginsburg literally wrote the book on sex discrimination and the law. Well, technically, she co-wrote it, and according to law professor Wendy Williams, it was the first casebook to cover the topic. Between 1970 and 1980, RBG was involved in roughly 60 gender equality cases, including more than 24 that went before the Supreme Court. She worked tirelessly and had such an enormous impact that she was dubbed the Thurgood Marshall of the women's movement. In retrospect, it seems like destiny, but when RBG first pursued a legal career, she had no intention of becoming a trailblazer. Ginsburg recalled enrolling in law school for personal selfish reasons. I thought I could do a lawyer's job better than any other. I have no talent in the arts, but I do write fairly well and analyze problems clearly. But simply pursuing law made her a rarity. She was one of just 9 women to attend Harvard Law School in 1956, and her professor let her know she wasn't welcome. RBG turned out to be a phenomenal student at Harvard and Columbia Law, which she later attended. She was also a top-notch intern, but she received worse pay and worse treatment than her male colleagues in the workforce and decided to be a vehicle for change.
I ask no favor for my sex. All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet off our necks.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg died of complications from cancer on September 18, 2020. The justice had cancerous growths removed in December 2018, but her history with the disease stretched back much further. Ginsburg's first oncological battle happened back in 1999, 6 years after being appointed to the Supreme Court. The Washington Post reported that doctors first misdiagnosed her illness as acute diverticulitis. Thankfully, someone realized she had colon cancer before it progressed too far. In 2009, Ginsburg was afflicted with pancreatic cancer. Fortunately, her tumor was detected about as early as technologically possible per ABC. In November 2018, her lung cancer was discovered after she fell and fractured multiple ribs. Metastatic cancer of the pancreas ultimately ended her life, but RBG remained sharp and active to the bitter end, making her not only a progressive political hero, but an example of determination and drive for people of every political persuasion.